Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Maya Rochelle Thompson. Thank you for joining us. Today, we return to a chapter of Atlanta's history that has never stopped echoing, an episode that shaped a city, traumatized families, and left questions that, 4 decades later, still demand answers. We're talking about the Atlanta child murders of 1979 to 1981. At least 28 young Black lives taken, and a debate that never really ended about whether those killings were truly solved. I want to be clear from the start about the mood here. Somber, reflective, and haunting. We'll center the children and the families. We'll also look at the investigation, the forensic evidence, the trial of Wayne Williams, and why many people still doubt the official story. And I'm not alone in that conversation. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Leonard "Lenny" Carrington. Lenny, thank you so much for being here.
Maya, thank you for having me. This is heavy ground, but it's necessary.
Lenny is a criminologist and legal historian at Emory. He's a Black Atlanta native, and this is important. He was a teenager here during those years. He spent decades studying the case, Wayne Williams, fiber analysis, and how policing and politics shaped that era. Lenny, maybe start by telling listeners, what did Atlanta look and feel like in the late 1970s? Help us set the scene.
Atlanta then was a city wearing two faces at once. On the one hand, it was proudly projecting itself as the Black Mecca. Morehouse, Spelman, Clark, first Black Mayor Maynard Jackson. There was real civic ambition and national pride. On the other hand, many Black neighborhoods were being reshaped by urban renewal and freeway construction that fragmented communities and pushed people into more isolated corridors. Those geographic shifts, abandoned lots, wooded overpasses, isolated roads, helped create the conditions the killer, or killers, could exploit. It's a tragic irony.
Right. So that's the story of a city trying to brand itself as upwardly mobile, while parts of it were structurally neglected. People often forget how environment matters in investigations.
Exactly. And add in national trends, rising urban crime rates, fears about gangs and drugs, and you get an anxious city where parents felt both hopeful and deeply vulnerable. When the first disappearances began, there was a natural tendency to assume these were runaways or isolated tragedies. The pattern wasn't obvious at first.
Let's walk through that pattern. The material lists a set of early victims in 1979: Edward Hope Teddy Smith, Alfred Q. Evans, Milton Harvey, Yusuf Bell. Can you summarize how those early cases drew investigators and community attention?
Sure. Mid-July 1979, Teddy Smith, 14, and Alfred Evans, 13, disappear within days of each other. Their bodies were found on July 28, 1979. Teddy had a .22 caliber gunshot wound in his upper back. Then, in September, Milton Harvey, 14, vanished while riding a bike, and his body was recovered later. Yusuf Bell, age 9, disappeared in October after going to a corner store. A witness said he was seen getting into a blue car, and his body was found in an abandoned elementary school in November. He'd been hit on the head and strangled and had masking tape on his shorts. Early on, police didn't immediately connect these cases publicly, but families and community members, well, they felt the pattern forming before authorities did.
I want to pause on that. Families recognizing a pattern before police did. That's important. It speaks to local knowledge being sidelined.
It does. And by spring 1980, it escalated. Angel Lanier, 12, disappeared, later found with hands tied and underwear stuffed in her mouth. Jeffrey Mathis, Anthony Carter, Earl Terrell, Clifford Jones. By mid-1980, bodies were being discovered frequently, and parents were terrified. Children were kept indoors, volunteer patrols formed. The city felt under siege.
Yeah. That image, streets emptied, kids kept inside, it's a haunting one. Let's talk about how the investigation ramped up. The FBI came in with a profile. John Douglas and others suggested a young black man from the community. There was also a strategy to stake out bridges. Tell us about how that move toward waterways became a focus.
The FBI profilers predicted that the killer might dump bodies in a river to get rid of trace evidence. As more bodies turned up in and near the Chattahoochee River, police began stakeouts on bridges over waterways. That strategy led, on the night of May 22, 1981, to a critical incident. An officer on stakeout heard a loud splash under a bridge and shortly afterward saw a white station wagon turning around. The vehicle was stopped half a mile away, and the driver was Wayne Bertram Williams, a 23-year-old music promoter and photographer. 2 days later, Nathaniel Cater's body was found downstream. From there, the case pivoted toward Williams.
And Wayne Williams became the center of the story. Before we dig into the arrest and trial, can you describe who Williams was, according to the documents and reporting we have?
Williams was born in 1958 in Atlanta and raised by solidly middle-class parents. He was an aspiring music producer, a freelance photographer, known in some circles as a hustling self-promoter who moved among young musicians. Not the typical street criminal stereotype many expected. He had access to equipment, cars, tapes, details that police later argued could explain how he would have lured young people. After the bridge stop, he voluntarily spoke with police and later failed an FBI polygraph. Polygraphs aren't admissible in court, but that failure intensified suspicion.
The evidence that followed, fibers, dog hairs, carpeting, became central. The prosecution used what would now feel like a precocious reliance on forensic pattern evidence. Lenny, can you explain how the fiber and hair evidence was presented at trial?
At the time, fiber and hair comparison was cutting edge. Prosecutors presented a pattern link in fibers from a distinctive green nylon carpet in Williams's home, bedspreads, car upholstery, and dog hair from the family German Shepherd, to fibers and hairs found on multiple victims. They argued these fibers were rare and that the chance of them appearing across so many victims by coincidence was extremely low. Microscopic comparison of hairs was presented as strongly indicative. The prosecution also introduced 10-12 pattern murders in addition to the 2 formal counts, trying to show Williams was the serial killer behind the Atlanta child murders, even though he was only tried for the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne.
And the defense pushed back, arguing chain of custody issues, secondary transfer, and that many households could have similar textiles. They also said there was tunnel vision. Once Williams was a suspect, other leads were sidelined. Lenny?
Right. The defense emphasized that forensic fiber statistics in that era were weaker than they were presented, and that the methodologies didn't have the population databases we use today. Secondary transfer, fibers moving between people, shared environments, schoolyards, was a plausible alternative. And the fact that Williams was never charged with any of the child murders, only the 2 adult victims, made many families feel their specific cases were being swept into a larger narrative without proper trials. That administrative closure, closing 22 cases after the conviction without separate trials, is one of the most controversial moves in this whole story.
Let me ask you directly, Lenny. Did the murders stop after Williams's arrest? Some point to that as evidence he was responsible for many or most of them.
It's true that the steady stream of murders slowed after his arrest in June 1981. That temporal correlation is part of the argument for Williams's guilt in a broader sense. But temporality alone isn't proof of causation. The pattern of victims changed over time. Early victims tended to be younger children, later victims older teens and adults, and methods varied. So scholars and some investigators have raised the possibility of multiple offenders. The basic technical answer is, the slowdown is consistent with the theory that he was at least responsible for some murders, but it doesn't conclusively prove he was responsible for all of them.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the trial itself. Jury selection began December 28, 1981. Opening statements in January 1982. Lenny, what stood out about the trial and its outcome?
The trial formally began January 6, 1982, before Judge Clarence Cooper. The jury was 12 jurors, 9 women, 3 men, 8 black, 4 white. After about 11 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Williams of the 2 murders, Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, in February 1982, and he received 2 consecutive life sentences with the possibility of parole. The prosecutors had achieved a conviction on 2 counts, but, as we said earlier, the city administratively closed dozens of other cases, attributing them to Williams without separate trials. That administrative closure arguably traded legal finality for narrative finality, declaring the broader Atlanta child murders solved on paper while leaving many families without individualized legal reckoning.
That phrasing, narrative finality, I want to underline it. Official closure can be different from felt closure. Some families accepted the conviction. Others, like Catherine Leach, publicly insisted Williams didn't kill their children, saying, "Wayne Williams didn't kill our children. No, and we want justice." That quote comes straight from our material. Lenny, you were a teenager in Atlanta then. What was the local atmosphere after the conviction?
There was relief among many, a sense that the terror might be over. But that relief was complicated. Some families felt sidelined. Others distrusted the evidentiary basis. For those who had lost a child, a verdict about 2 adult victims didn't always feel like justice for their murdered child. And whispers about potential Klan involvement, about other suspects, about investigative shortcuts persisted. Trust in institutions wasn't restored everywhere. Some people wanted the mayor and police to say, "Case closed," and move on to business and development. Other people wanted the investigations to continue until every child's case was specifically and transparently resolved.
Which brings us to those alternative leads, the alleged Klan involvement and the idea of multiple killers. The record shows investigators at one point quietly pursued Klan leads, but feared publicizing that because of the risk of race riots. Lenny, how should listeners understand that part of the story?
There's documentation that investigators secretly pursued leads involving Klan members or white supremacist extremists. Reporting in later years, New York Times and local investigations, suggest that internal probes explored the possibility that Klan members could be involved. But those investigations were not aired in court. Officials feared that public disclosure might provoke unrest. These leads remained largely unproven in public documentation, but their existence fuels skepticism. It's not an airtight theory. It's a troubling possibility, and it speaks to how race and politics shaped investigative decisions. If law enforcement had been transparent, families and the public could weigh those leads publicly. Instead, much remained behind closed doors.
Right. That secrecy, it erodes trust. And then there's the science. Let's dig into the forensic evidence again, specifically fiber and dog hair testimony. The prosecution made these things central, but later reassessments questioned their strength. Can you explain how forensic science looked then versus now?
In the early 1980s, fiber and hair comparison was considered cutting edge. Experts used microscopic characteristics, color, shape, composition, to compare hairs and fibers from victims to items seized from Williams's home and car. Prosecutors argued the fibers were rare and the dog hairs matched Williams's German Shepherd. But these methods are comparative, not unique like DNA. Later critiques pointed out that population databases and robust statistical backdrops were missing in that era. There was also the risk of secondary transfer. Contact with common spaces could spread fibers. In 2007, limited DNA testing on dog hairs reportedly could not conclusively match them to Williams's dog. Results were ambiguous. That ambiguity undermines one of the trial's linchpin forensic claims and feeds reasonable doubt about how definitive the 1982 forensic conclusions really were.
And that's why many families still want modern DNA testing. In 2019, the city announced a re-examination of evidence. Keisha Lance Bottoms and Chief Erica Shields ordered a review using modern techniques. Lenny, what happened with that review?
Officials did an inventory of existing evidence: clothing, fibers, hairs, ligatures. Some materials were degraded after decades in storage. Selected items were sent to a private lab in Utah that specialized in degraded DNA and advanced methods. But authorities cautioned that results might be limited or inconclusive. As of late 2022 and into 2025, no significant new, publicized results had been disclosed. Families have expressed frustration at the lack of transparency, asking what was tested, what was found, and if the city plans to disclose findings. The opacity continues to feed the sense that answers are being withheld, or that the system still isn't accountable to victims' families.
If those modern tests did yield new DNA matches linking Williams to more victims, what would that mean? And conversely, if they contradicted the fiber evidence, what then?
If modern DNA definitively linked Williams to additional victims, it would strengthen the official narrative that he was responsible for many of the murders. It could bring real closure for some families. Conversely, if DNA contradicted the fiber evidence, either excluding Williams or pointing to other suspects, that would be seismic. It could lead to reopened investigations, potential legal challenges, and a re-examination of administrative closures. But given the degraded state of evidence, officials have warned that conclusive DNA may not be possible. So we're left with uncertainty, which is deeply unsatisfying.
Yeah, I see. Let's return to the families. This episode centers their experience. The archive shows parents formed volunteer patrols, kept kids inside, and many felt initially dismissed by police. How did that affect the long-term emotional fallout?
Parents report enduring PTSD-like symptoms, fear, and unresolved anger. Siblings describe growing up with a murdered brother or sister as a defining trauma that reshaped their lives. Grief was compounded by stigma. Some victims were labeled runaways or petty criminals, which implicitly blamed them. And for families whose children's cases were administratively closed without a specific prosecution, there's a sense of erasure. Their child's case became an appendage of a larger narrative. The Eternal Flame Memorial in June 2023 at City Hall was meaningful to many families. They said the memorial proved the children are not forgotten. But memorialization is not the same as accountability or transparent answers.
That memorial, Atlanta Children's Eternal Flame, it's an important symbol. Families like June Thompson, sibling of Darren Glass, said it proves the children are never forgotten. But as you say, memorials alone don't answer the outstanding questions. Lenny, there are people who say the murders stopped after Williams was arrested, case closed. Others say he was convicted of 2 murders and never tried for the kids. That's not closure. How do you help the public hold those 2 views at once?
They're both true in different senses. Legally, Williams was convicted of 2 murders. Those convictions stand. Administratively, many cases were closed and attributed to him. From a historical and moral perspective, however, declaring the entire series solved without individual trials or transparent corroboration leaves room for doubt. People can accept that Williams may have been responsible for some murders while also acknowledging that other cases might be unrelated, mishandled, or even connected to other perpetrators, possibly including white supremacist violence that was never fully investigated. Holding those ideas simultaneously is uncomfortable, but it's necessary if we want a nuanced understanding.
Complex.
Very complex.
Let's talk about the multiple killers hypothesis. Source material notes shifts in victim age, methods like a shot in the early victim, different dump patterns. Is it plausible there were several offenders whose crimes got bundled together?
Plausible, yes. The victim profile evolved from younger children early on to older teens and adults later. Some early victims were shot, others strangled or asphyxiated. Geographic patterns overlap but aren't perfectly consistent. These variations can be explained by one offender evolving or by multiple offenders operating simultaneously or sequentially. In some cases, investigators in subsequent decades said certain murders may not fit the pattern neatly. The danger of bundling is that unrelated cases get closed without the individualized investigation required to bring specific perpetrators to justice. If multiple killers were at work, then administrative closure in the early 1980s could have left other perpetrators free.
Short term. Lenny, what about the political pressures? The city leaders, Maynard Jackson, Andrew Young, had enormous stakes in Atlanta's image. Did that factor influence how authorities declared case closed?
Yes. Atlanta's black leadership was under pressure to restore confidence, both civic and economic. There was a clear political incentive to show control, reassure businesses and investors, and protect the city's reputation as a rising hub. That created incentives to find a narrative that could be presented as resolution. Whether that led to shortcuts and investigation or premature administrative closures is a matter of debate, but the pressure to demonstrate a solution was certainly present.
Okay, I want to switch gears and talk about culture and media. Coverage shifted this from a local tragedy to national attention. ABC's 2020, CNN documentaries, HBO's Atlanta's Missing and Murdered, and even dramatizations like the 1985 miniseries. How did media attention shape public understanding?
Media attention amplified fear, but also forced accountability. ABC's 2020, for example, exposed the task force's failure to systematically pursue every hotline tip. National coverage brought pressure to act. Docuseries and dramas in later years have done different things. Some recenter families and structural racism, others dramatize the investigation and broaden public awareness. But dramatizations can compress nuance, and fictional accounts can shape myth as much as memory. The HBO series foregrounded families' perspectives, which shifted the focus away from the lone monster narrative to systemic failings. That recalibration was important for public understanding.
And then there are books and novels, like Tayari Jones's Leaving Atlanta, which centers children's psychological experience. The cultural memory continues to evolve. Yeah.
Right.
Lenny, one of the recurring frustrations is transparency around the 2019 DNA review. Families want to know precisely what was tested, what was found, and why nothing decisive has been made public. From an institutional perspective, what are the possible reasons for such opacity?
Possible reasons include the tests were inconclusive, so officials feared raising hopes. Evidence degradation limited what labs could do. Chain of custody or contamination concerns made authorities cautious about publicizing preliminary results. And legal or investigative strategies, protecting ongoing inquiries, might have constrained disclosure. But none of that eliminates families' need for answers. When there's so little public disclosure, it feeds suspicion that evidence contradicts official narratives or that agencies are simply not prioritizing transparency. In high-profile, racially charged cases, lack of transparency is particularly corrosive.
Can you say whether, based on your review of the material, the fiber evidence would meet today's forensic standards?
No. The fiber evidence as presented in 1982 would not meet today's standards for uniqueness. Microscopic fiber comparison is still useful, but without robust statistical population data and DNA corroboration, it's much weaker than what juries expect now. The dog hair evidence, likewise, was ambiguous in later testing. So, in modern courtrooms, those pieces would be far less persuasive, absent DNA or direct eyewitness linkage.
That's telling. We need to ask, what does justice look like for the families now? Is it DNA? Trials? Public acknowledgement of investigative missteps? Or is it a combination?
It's a combination. Families want truthful, precise answers about their children's cases. For some, a DNA match is everything. For others, an honest accounting of how investigations were handled and acknowledgement of mistakes or unknowns is necessary. Memorials matter too. The eternal flame says the city remembers, but symbolic acts aren't a substitute for transparent investigative work and accountability. For many families, justice means the state doing what it can to identify perpetrators, reopen where evidence warrants, and be fully accountable about limitations.
Lenny, are there any misconceptions you want to clear up for listeners who follow true crime and may be tempted to reduce this to a single headline?
Yes. Don't equate fiber evidence with DNA certainty. Don't assume administrative closure equals courtroom truth for every individual case. And don't leap to conclude either that Williams killed every victim or that a Klan conspiracy is conclusively proven. The truth likely sits somewhere complex in the middle. The public needs nuance.
Yeah, nuance is messy, but necessary. Before we wrap, let's imagine, hypothetically, what would a meaningful next step look like for authorities, listening families, and the public?
First, transparency. Publish a clear inventory of what evidence was tested and what labs did, even if results are negative or inconclusive. Second, release a public methodology statement. Explain why certain items were testable and others weren't, and what limitations existed. Third, where DNA points to new leads, reopen those investigations and pursue them openly. Fourth, continue support for families, emotional, legal, and communicative. And finally, incorporate those findings into public memory, accurately acknowledging both what we know and what remains unknown.
That last point, how we remember, is critical. Lenny, one final question. Decades from now, how do you think historians will look back on Atlanta's response to these murders?
I think historians will see this as a defining crisis moment in Atlanta's civic life, where racial politics, urban renewal, forensic science, and media attention intersected. They'll note both the city's remarkable civic ambitions and its painful blind spots, how marginalized neighborhoods were vulnerable, how families felt dismissed, and how the desire for a tidy resolution may have pushed officials toward administrative closure. They'll also see this as an evolution in forensic science, an example of how what counts as proof changes over time. Ultimately, I expect historians will call for humility in our conclusions. There were real lives lost, and many of the answers are still painfully unknown.
Thank you, Lenny. That humility is a good place to end this substantive part of the conversation. Before we close, I want to share a few final notes with listeners. 1. The official count is often stated as 28 or 29 victims. The exact number is contested, and for many families, there's still a sense of personal loss that never got legally recognized. 2. Wayne Williams remains incarcerated, convicted in 1982 of 2 adult murders and denied parole as of 2019 reports. 3. The city's 2019 re-examination promised modern DNA testing, but as of our latest material, there's been no decisive public disclosure. And 4, Atlanta unveiled the Eternal Flame Memorial in June 2023 to honor the children and their families. Short note: if you're moved by this episode and want to learn more, our sources include archival reporting and documentaries, ABC's 2020 reporting, CNN's documentary from 2010, HBO's Atlanta's Missing and Murdered series, and contemporary reporting by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and others. If you want to read fiction that captures the psychological landscape, Tayari Jones's Leaving Atlanta is a powerful evocation.
Maya, if I can add one more thing very quickly. When we talk about the science, the politics, the memorials, always keep the families in mind. Their grief doesn't fit into neat narratives. Their demand for answers is not just about closing a case, it's about being seen and heard. That, to me, is the moral urgency of this story.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, if you take anything away today, let it be that unresolved questions about these children are not mere academic debate. They are living wounds for people who lost sons, brothers, cousins, friends. Justice requires more than a neat headline. It requires sustained transparency and accountability. We'll be posting a transcript of this episode and a reading list in the show notes, including the sources we relied on for this conversation. Please check those if you want to dive deeper. Lenny, any final words you want to leave with folks?
Just this. Keep asking questions. Don't settle for capsule narratives. And recognize that the way we respond to such tragedies, who we count, whom we believe, how we investigate, says a lot about who we are as a city and a nation. Remember the children.
Thank you, Dr. Leonard Carrington. And thank you all for listening to Still Unanswered. If this episode resonated for you, please share it with someone who cares about criminal justice reform, forensic science, and the stories families tell when institutions fall short. We'll be back next week with another episode where we ask the same stubborn question: what does justice look like when the official story doesn't satisfy the people most harmed? Until then, softly, take care of one another. This is Maya Rochelle Thompson. Thank you to Dr. Leonard Lenny Carrington. Good night.